I call the Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, in the House and the government's program to get the economy on track, to strengthen it and to raise incomes. And Mr Speaker, we need to keep in mind, we need reminded, I think, all of us every now and again about the scale of the change no means alone. Most of the countries that followed the same policy prescriptions as New Zealand over the last 10 years have found themselves in the same position. And I'll just use, for example, the discussion about debt levels, because that clearly is going between the government's interest in getting New Zealand's debt down and government debt, and getting government debt down, and the Labor Party who take a different view about debt and seem to think that because it's cheap you can have, if it's cheap you should have endless amounts of it. The average household in New Zealand in 2003 owed $61,000. That's on average, and that includes all types of credit, of which mortgages were the most, obviously the largest, but credit card debt, consumer debt, overdrafts, and of course they're not distributed evenly across households. Some households are debt-free, and the older households tend to be debt-free. The younger households tend to have a lot of debt. But in 2003, on average, it was $61,000. By 2008, just 5 short years later, it was $107,000. And that is by far the fastest rise in debt burden that New Zealand's seen over any reasonable period. So the average household now owes $107,000. Now, New Zealanders have fortunately understood the risks of that. They understand that if interest rates are rising, it's going to eat into their standard of living, because they'll have to pay more interest on what is now a much larger stock of debt than they had before. Much of that debt has been incurred in buying houses off each other or consumer goods, none of which generate a return to the economy. So New Zealanders are now being careful with their spending, and they're trying to pay off debt. But we've barely made a dent in that $107,000. Meantime, the people who lent it to us still want us to pay interest, and we have to keep going back to them through the banks to roll over that debt. So if, for instance, we thought that $61,000 was enough debt per household, then every household in New Zealand would have to pay off $40,000 of debt. Well, that would have an enormous impact on this economy, because it's money that would not be going into the job-rich areas such as the retail sector or building new houses. Even if we think $107,000 is about the right amount, it still represents a lot of constraint in this economy. And so it's that burden of debt that households have built up, which has now become quite a considerable drag on economic growth. And until households believe that they've got their debt at the right level, that they can cover the risks of interest rate rising on that debt as the economy recovers, they're not going to go out and spend up. In the agricultural sector, it's worse. In the agricultural sector, debt per farm more than doubled over the period from 2003 to 2008. So even despite the fact that we've got record commodity prices, we are not seeing that money flowing into the shops in Hamilton and in Invercargill, because the farming community is having to pay down the debt that it ran up, some on productive investment, but most on bidding up the prices of farms and buying them off each other. So again, while conditions are favourable with very high commodity prices, it is going to take some time for that to filter back into the economy, because the debt hole out on our farms is so large, and they will be pouring their profits into that hole for some time yet. And Mr Speaker, the same kind of scale of rebalancing is evident when it comes to job growth. If we think of the economy as 80% non-tradable, that's domestic, not competing with the rest of the world, and about 20% of it is the export sector and the tradable economy by jobs. The non-tradable sector was delivering a lot of new jobs over the last decade, but far too many of them were funded by the debt that I've just been talked about and by big increases in government spending. That simply can't continue, and it's not continuing. New Zealanders have decided that won't continue. The government's been a bit slower, and we are deciding that we will have to tighten up. So the job growth is substantial job growth is not going to come from that 80% of the economy. There will be some, and there has been. In the last 15 months, there's been 35,000 new jobs in the non-tradable sector, but that's 80% of the economy. The sustainable job growth has to occur in the other 20%. What happened in the export sector in the 5 years to 2009 was jobs shrank by 55,000. We had 55,000 less people in the export sector 5 years on from 2003. That has just turned around, and with the high commodity prices, it should keep turning around. So we've got 20% of the economy that needs to grow very fast to offset the fact that the other 80% of the economy that used to generate all the jobs now is heavily constrained by debt and won't be growing near as many jobs as it used to. So there is a long road ahead of us to get a vibrant job-generating export sector up and going when it's been on its knees for a fair bit of the last decade, shrinking in production and shrinking in jobs. Mr. Speaker, that brings me to the issue of the public sector, which the Prime Minister addressed in his speech. We're very keen to see an enthusiastic, professional and innovative public sector. And not only are we keen to see it, it's an absolute necessity, because New Zealanders' demands and expectations for public services have not shrunk because of a recession. Those demands and expectations have continued to grow. In fact, those expectations are probably lifting. People expect better health care, they expect better education, they expect more effective law and order from the police and the prison system. So the government is focusing on producing more and better public services, knowing it's going to have to do it for less. I expect the opposition will rant on about cuts like they usually do. Well, so in the time since they left office, we've reprioritised $4 billion of, yeah, well, there you go, they call it cuts. So any dollar spent in the public sector under Labor is a dollar that can't go anywhere else. Well, they're the only people in New Zealand who think that. Every household, every business in New Zealand has had to reorganise its affairs, and the public sector is going to need to reorganise in order to produce more and better services, and we are determined to do that. The government will go about this task, as it has so far, in a very considered and thoughtful manner. We've already initiated quite a lot of change across the public sector. Increasingly, the public sector is taking leadership of that change, because they can see that to have satisfying professional lives, to meet their strong ethic of public service, things will need to be done a bit differently. And it's going to be the government's role to support them in that task. They are aware of the financial constraints. They've heard that message for a couple of years. The rest of the community is aware of the financial constraints, which is why they take no notice of Labor's ranting about cuts, because they know actually Labor oversaw a pretty bloated public sector, which is now being brought into line. So I look forward to, along with the team in the national-led government, to participating in a process that sees improvements in public services at the same time as we get the government finances into line, reduce our record-breaking liabilities to overseas lenders, and get this economy up and running and producing more jobs.
The member that his time is